Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part three as we look at the Gospel of Mark. And we left off, with the beginning portion of the end of Jesus's ministry. And so, we referenced Palm Sunday where Jesus arrives in Jerusalem on a colt. John puts a colt as a donkey specifically, and how the individuals are spreading their cloaks before him and palms and shouting Hosanna, which is Hebrew for, save us, please save us. And then Jesus has a Passover meal, the last meal with his disciples, where he institutes the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, and he mentions that he will be betrayed by a disciple and denied by Peter, who historically speaking is his chief disciple, his chief apostle. Well, after being betrayed by his disciple Judas Iscariot, he's tried before the Sanhedrin, which is essentially a Jewish court. However, historians question Mark's account of the trial. In the case with Judas Iscariot, of course, how the scene is depicted in films and movies is that Judas kisses Jesus to identify him to the Jewish authorities, the the high priest, the chief priests of the temple. Mark's gospel doesn't reference anything about a kiss. Matthew's and Luke's do so, and I can't remember off the top of my head if John does. But regardless of which, he's taken before the Sanhedrin, which is essentially a Jewish court, and he's tried, but historians question Mark's account of the trial. Why do they question Mark's account of it? Well, for one, the trial happened at night. The Sanhedrin was not known for meeting at night. That was one big issue. Another issue is some of the dialogue where Jesus, admits to being whom he is essentially accused of being, the Messiah. And, when Jesus is before Pilate, when Pilate, asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" his response is, "You say so." Where basically he doesn't admit to it. He just throws it back to the questioner. And you don't have that in Mark's account. At the same time, though, Jesus admitting to being the Messiah would carry a lot less penalty, really, technically speaking, it would carry no penalty than him admitting to being the king of the Jews, which could be seen as him challenging Roman authority as who would be the client king according to who the Romans decide ultimately. Well, the trial before the Sanhedrin, it marks the end of the messianic secret, and Jesus is condemned by the high priest, by Caiaphas, who's depicted here on the bottom screen as tearing his clothes as a sign of disgrace. But what was it that Jesus said, that was considered to be so blasphemous? So, what exactly did he say here? And of course, where Mark is getting this information from would ultimately be from oral history. He doesn't mention a source in there to give him this information, so it's arguably, obviously going to come from oral history. But what was it that Jesus said that was considered blasphemous that would cause, the high priest Caiaphas to tear his clothes and essentially condemn, Jesus to die, even though he didn't have really the authority to do that. It was the Romans that, signed Jesus's death warrant. But what exactly did he say? What did Jesus say that was so bad? Um, him calling himself the Messiah, admitted to being the Messiah, which would mark the end of the messianic secret. Well, lots of people claim to be the Messiah both before and after the time period of Jesus. There's even a statement within Judaism that if someone claims that they have found the Messiah, the the response to that is that what you're supposed to do is to go plant a tree and then go and meet the Messiah. And the kind of underlying, message there is that the person claiming to be the Messiah is probably not the Messiah. So go and plant a tree first, do something good. But anyway, people claim to be the Messiah both before and after Jesus. So, that's not blasphemy per se. Well, what about, him, say, admitting to being the Son of God? Well, again, that's not necessarily blasphemous. I mean, we can all say we're the sons and daughters of God. Jesus might, use that term in a way that perhaps many Jewish people would find to be arrogant, but that's certainly not enough to, have him to be executed. But one thing that has been referenced perhaps is him claiming to be the Son of Man, which comes from the book of Daniel, which is essentially an apocalyptic Jewish text. And I want to read a portion here from the book of Daniel on this. As I being Daniel, watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One, and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, and shall not pass away. And his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. Now, would that be considered blasphemous to call yourself the Son of Man? In of itself, no. I mean, Caiaphas may have, taken offense at that because it would put Jesus, in a sense, above him, but it doesn't necessarily qualify as blasphemy. If anything, I would say that, Mark thought that something that was said um, to, something Jesus said before the Sanhedrin that, he felt that Caiaphas said, Jesus said something blasphemous, or that Jesus said something blasphemous to Caiaphas, the high priest. But, with what's in his account, that's not quite the case. But Mark himself, thought that, Caiaphas felt that something Jesus said was blasphemous. And I'll also again, mention, the questions that historians have with Mark's account. Um, I'd say personally that perhaps, Luke has a more accurate account of what happened before the Sanhedrin. But anyway, so now turning to Jesus before Pilate, and behold the man. Well, Jesus, he's brought before Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Judea, and Pilate, he initiates a prisoner exchange between Jesus and a man named Barabbas. So you have a prisoner exchange here between Jesus, who's accused essentially of being named the King of the Jews, and a man named Barabbas, who was charged with committing insurrection. I would say, if anything, Barabbas, in terms of the religious slash political parties, would have been a zealot. However, historians do question the prisoner exchange. And why do they question this prisoner exchange? Well, let's look at some of the reasons for why. One is that Paul's letters, the Apostle Paul, and his letters which predate the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, they don't mention anything about a prisoner exchange. Paul mentions Jesus' execution and that it was by crucifixion, but he doesn't say anything about a prisoner exchange. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, and Tacitus, who was a Roman senator and historian, a Gentile, non Jew, they mention Jesus' death in their writings less than 100 years after it took place. With Josephus, he mentions Jesus twice in the Antiquities of the Jews. One portion was certainly corrupted by Christian scribes, but nonetheless, the death of Jesus is referenced. Tacitus mentions Jesus' death in the Annals of Rome. They mention how Pilate was the person that essentially signed Jesus's death warrant, but they say nothing about a prisoner exchange. So again, both of them mention the death of Jesus less than 100 years after it took place. They mention that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, is who essentially signed Jesus's death warrant that basically said execute him. But they don't say anything about there being a prisoner exchange, the whole behold the man, which is the portrait on the screen. Well, here are two understandings of the prisoner exchange then. One is that if the prisoner exchange did take place, it was probably the only time Pilate allowed such a thing. There is evidence of prisoner exchanges taking place in the ancient world during this time period and taking place during festivals like this. This would, of course, been the Passover festival for the Jewish people. But one of the notable things with the prisoner exchange is that if a prisoner is released, once that festival is over, the prisoner is supposed to go back. He's supposed to come back. So that would mean that even if the crowd yelled for Jesus and Jesus was freed, that after the prisoner exchange, he was supposed to go back. And would that have actually happened? Probably not. So, in the case with Barabbas, whom the crowd chooses, this would mean that after, the festival is over, he would supposed to go back to Pilate, which arguably didn't happen. So, if there was a prisoner exchange, it was probably the only time Pilate would allow such a thing. But the second argument here is that if the prisoner exchange did not take place, that it was a creation from Mark due to the situation he found himself in. So, what exactly would be going on here with Mark? Well, if the year 70 CE/AD is accurate for one of the earliest writings, which is what many historians hold, this would have been a few years after Nero's persecution of Christians. So that certainly would have had an effect on Mark. And also, this would have taken place during the Roman Jewish War. So, by essentially having where the crowd, you could say turned on Jesus, it basically puts Mark and his community away or different from the Jewish community. It's a way of separating the two. Well, we're going to need to stop here, but when we come back, we'll finish up a little bit that's left here with the Gospel of Mark. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.